again, welcome. My name is Jennifer Roberts, and I am here representing TESOL as well as the International Civil Aviation English Association, ICAEA. For TESOL, I am currently the chair for the English for Specific Purposes interest section, and at ICAEA, I am privileged to be on the board. So one initiative that we did this year with TESOL, along with the Applied Linguistics interest section, was introduce a webinar series. We've actually done now 3 webinars, and today you are here to see webinar number 4. So just to give you a reminder and maybe excite you for also number 5, you can see here on my screen the 4 different webinars, well, the 5 webinars. We're here at number 4 with Michael. ICAEA's Test Design Guidelines Facilitating the Standardization of Aviation English Tests. So that's what you're going to hear about today. And you can see, you can put it on your radar for February 24th, that we'll have one more webinar with Moon-Young Park. He's going to talk about target tasks, task phases, and indigenous criteria for military aviation English. So if you're interested in that, you can tune in. As well, you see here a QR code if you're interested in ICAEA. Michael will talk a little bit more about ICAEA probably during his webinar, and we can answer any questions at the end. But you can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook. Of course, we have a website, so feel free to check us out. So today, our speaker is Michael Kay, and Michael is the current president of ICAEA, the International Civil Aviation English Association. He has worked in aviation English for 26 years in the areas of the language proficiency requirements, test design, development, and implementation. He works in curriculum design and delivery. He also has a master's degree in applied linguistics that focused on language testing, and he has worked at Aeronautical Radio of Thailand since 2011 in program and curriculum development to support the Thai ANSP for air traffic controllers. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael now. If you have any questions that you would like to put in the chat throughout this webinar, please feel free. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for Q&A. I'll go over the questions that are in the chat, but as well, you will be free to unmute your microphones and we can have a conversation. Okay, so thank you so much, Michael, for being here on behalf of TESOL and ICAEA, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm based here in Thailand, in Bangkok, as Jennifer alluded to in that introduction. And I've been involved in this sort of field, particularly this ICAEA test design guidelines over the last 4 years, I would say. So ICAEA is an association. It's been around for over 30 years, actually almost 40 years. Traditionally, it was based in Europe, but more recently, it's become a lot more global. And as I'm in Bangkok, and of course, Jennifer's in the US, you can see that reach is increasing. I'll talk a bit more about ICAEA a little bit later. So what we're going to talk about is, I know some of you may be a bit more familiar with this than others, but a little bit of background about the ICAO Language Proficiency Requirements. We'll talk about that just to give a sort of a background, the importance of language testing in that context, some challenges that have been emerging over the last, let's say, 15 years, and the effects these testing practices have had, particularly in the airline and ATC industry. Then that's the sort of groundwork for why we created the test design guidelines, a team of us within the board of ICAEA. We'll look at the criteria actually quite briefly. I'll give you a reference if you want to look at those in more detail later. And then I'll finish off with just looking at the history and how I'll call them the TDGs, that's how we refer to them, the test design guidelines, how that's tracking out for the future. So the ICAO LPRs. Now, all this is based on not just a manual, which we call document 9835. There's a little bit more to it, but this document provides guidelines. It came out in the early 2000s, and it was for all of the industry to become, for all the stakeholders, and you remember if you attended Neil's webinar, all the stakeholders involved in this field of how to consider what's involved in language testing. So the requirements are applicable to pilots and air traffic controllers. There's a rating scale. I won't go into this in any detail, but there's a rating scale that is really about listening and speaking. It comprises 6 levels and 6 criteria. Again, just speaking and listening. The focus, and this is really important for later, is on radio telephony. I'll talk about that a little bit later, radio telephony communication. And the results of these tests are required for licensing. So you could say it's a very high stakes test. It determines whether the pilots or the controllers are actually able to keep their license. Now, if you can see this here, this is an extract of 9835. It states very clearly that the purpose of the LPRs, the Language Proficiency Requirements, is to assess aeronautical radio telephony communication. And that's including between pilots and controllers. So standardized phraseology, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. That's really just around routine situations. Things are very predictable. And if we've got non-routine situations, that's where the plain English might creep in. And that's probably more the focus for the language testing, but still in that radio telephony context. Okay, a little bit of history about how this has played out. So 2003, the ICAO LPRs were first announced globally. And I would say that between 2005 and 2008, there was an initial deadline of 2008, that most states, most countries, organizations, airlines, ATC providers, they all started gathering information on what to do and how to tackle this. And there was this gradual lead up to 2008. But there was an extension introduced because not all the states were ready. But it did become effective for new licenses. So new pilots or new controllers needed to meet this requirement from 2008. So between 2008 and 2011, when that extension was given, there was this sort of wait and see approach. A lot of states, a lot of testing organizations sort of not sure what to do, but let's see what others are doing. And gradually testing started to gather pace. But this is the interesting thing, between 2009 and 2015, this sort of began to emerge a lot of variation in testing standards. And that's still happening, but after 2011, when the actual requirement became effective, this became a lot more of an issue. 2013, as a result of some of this variation, ICAO introduced what they called the Test Endorsement Scheme. Now that scheme is still active, but it's not compulsory for licensing or states to use tests that are endorsed. In fact, currently only one test is still recognized in this system. So between 2011 and today, we can see a large variation, and these variations continue. And I would say in the last 5 years, this is my observation, these testing practices are becoming a lot more accepted and probably even entrenched. So it's almost getting to the point where it's too hard to rewind, perhaps. And all this, of course, led to the creation of the test design guidelines. But a little bit before we go into that, how are the LPR jurisdictions set up? So all ICAO member states or countries have civil aviation authorities. They're the governing body, if you like, for licenses. So the CAAs, Civil Aviation Authorities, they oversee anything to do with licenses for pilots and controllers. And that means, of course, they're responsible for selecting, approving, and auditing LPR tests. Okay, let's just, before we go any further, I said it before, I'm based in Thailand. Let me have a look at why this is so important. why language testing is so important in this field. So to give you an example of a pilot taking off, they go through lots of, talk to lots of controllers. And now you see that map on the right. This is Thai airspace. It's organized into sectors. So every time an aircraft takes off, so I'll give you an example. If an aircraft took off from down here in the south, in Phuket, and flew up to the north, in Chiang Mai, for example, they're going to cross through lots and lots of en route sectors. I would say in this case, it's probably about 8. So every time they change sector, they're changing a controller, talking to a different person. So from ground to airport departing and cruising. And of course, if this is international, that there's a lot more controllers they're going to talk to. And then, of course, on arrival, they're talking to the approach controller, the ground controller, and as they taxi, a different controller again. So if we put that into context here, you can imagine a pilot taking off, they're going to be talking to a large number of different air traffic controllers. So recently I was in Melbourne, where I'm from in Australia. And if I thought about it, back to Bangkok, I would estimate that the pilots on the aircraft I took probably talked to, I would say, around 30 to 40 different air traffic controllers across the duration of a 9-hour flight. So you can see there's quite a need for this language testing for safety reasons. We'll come to that in a minute. So as it turns out, there have been many LPR tests developed. And the big question here, from our observation as ICAO, is how well those tests align with real communication needs. That's the first question. Are they actually addressing the needs of controllers and pilots? Second question there is, what aspects of language proficiency and communication skills do they actually assess? Are the ICAO levels different? Are they actually the same or different? This is a really important question because, for example, we could have 2 different tests that test very different things, but they still claim to produce the same results in the minimum here for level 4 for licensing. A simple analogy, if it's a maths test and they get a level 4 and a spelling test and they get a level 4, of course they're not assessing the same things, despite what the test providers might say. So obviously this has potential safety and efficiency issues because of different interpretations of these standards and different testing practices. And at the moment, there's still no uniform approach and effective approach to oversight. Remember, that sits with the CAAs. CAAs and other stakeholders have a lot of, they're basically new to this field of language testing. It might sound like it's been around for 15, 20 years, but they're still relatively new to this field. And they tend to rely on ICAO document 9835, that manual I referred to earlier, is almost like a text that cannot be changed, very prescriptive, even though sometimes it's just intended to be guidelines and there are sometimes ambiguities in that text. We'll have a look at one in a minute. The stakeholders here, the CAAs, the air traffic, the ANSPs, air navigation service providers, and the airlines, the training providers, and the pilots and the controllers themselves, they all have different vested interests in what the tests do and what levels they produce. But overall, the market forces in the last 15 years is they tend to be lowering standards. And this is something I don't think was well anticipated. Now let's have a look at one of these examples of an example of source of these differences in testing practices. By the way, I think it's worth pointing out that these LPRs, they're all based on a common rating scale. And I'm not aware of any other example in language testing where this exists. So lots of different tests developed in isolation where they all refer to a common rating scale And within that, there's a need for them to be equivalent. Now, have a look at this text here. I'm not going to read it out, but the main point in 9835 is it suggests there's two interpretations that we can apply in language testing. One is that tests need to replicate the radio telephony communications context in some form in their test. And the other interpretation is, well, that's not necessarily the case. You can try to assess language outside that context and make some assumptions that those skills will transfer in a radio telephony communication context. And this, I think, is the main source in terms of test design where such big variations have occurred. And you'll see that last statement says both interpretations are valid. Now, unfortunately, in terms of our view, ICAO's the test design guidelines team, our view, we've researched this a lot. We've got a lot of expertise in language testing. We disagree with that last statement, both interpretations being valid. In fact, in ESP testing, the narrow interpretation is recommended. In other words, authenticity is key to effective language testing. And authenticity supports the validity of the test. In other words, the target language use domains in which the pilots or controllers are being tested needs to mirror real-world communication contexts. Now, those of you who know a little bit about language testing, that'll all make sense for you. But this has certainly had effect on how testing is played out. So there's different views on what needs to be assessed and therefore how. And there's a focus, I think, probably an overt focus on accommodating the descriptors in the ICAO rating scale to the point where it influences the test design and the tasks that are used. At the moment, I think there's an inability to assess the full spectrum efficiently. As I said before, there's this lack of experience and expertise in this field. It sort of skews the results, if you like. You might think, oh, well, why aren't the language testing organizations involved in this? They've got expertise. Well, they have, but it's a very specific field. And I think we could look back and say a lot of CAAs are involved in developing them tests themselves, or organizations that are not necessarily experts in language testing have become involved. Yes, some do, but not necessarily the majority. Okay, why is this really important? So as you saw in those pictures before, the language testing in this field, there's this striving force for standardization. We need to be confident that a pilot talking to a controller has a roughly about the same level and therefore are being assessed on the same thing. And at the moment, we're comparing apples and oranges. I'm sure you're familiar with this expression. We can't compare apples and oranges effectively. Let me give you an example. So what that means, comparing apples and oranges. Let's look at a regional situation where we might have 4 countries that have been designing and developing, implementing ICAO LPR tests. So they come up in isolation, very important here, in isolation with their concept of how to design and develop a test. So they all come up with their own perception, if you like, of what a level 4 is. Remember, that's the minimum requirement for licensing to achieve a test, to develop a test. And in this graphic here, I've got this green bar representing, if you like, the pure ideal level 4. So because they're developed in isolation, it's highly likely, and in fact, this is the case, that tests are not necessarily assessing the same components and the same level. In other words, they're not standard. Now, if that's the case, as ICAO had initially intended, below level 4 means they're not suitable for licensing. Those test takers who achieve a score below level 4 shouldn't be flying, in fact, not in international airspace. So there's clear safety implications already. But let's look at this a bit further. over the last 20 years, there's not just one test being developed in most countries, but multiple tests. And again, they're competing and they're producing tests in isolation. Yes, the CAA is overseeing it, but as I said before, the CAAs are not necessarily equipped to audit or recognize best practice. So if we put those 3 tests into the population and they're used over a few years, you can predict what will happen. And this is what I was talking about with market forces. The dominant test will be the one that gives the results that the industry, the individuals want. You know, that's the one that's most likely to be the dominant test. It doesn't mean the others are not continuing, but the dominant test, in this case test A, is the one that has the most test takers involved and therefore the most licenses issued around that test. But of course, in our region here, our hypothetical region, many tests are being developed. And if again we put those onto the spectrum and we've got those dominant tests, we're seeing standards tend to be lowered. And there's even a tendency where pilots, you know, pilots are highly mobile. They can cross between different countries within a region and seek out a test they may prefer. Again, lowering those standards. But let's look at this in terms of what was originally intended with the LPRs. Pilots and controllers talking to each other over the radio. Now, if there's a gap here between country A, in this case country D, in their proficiency level, we've got a problem here because we've got a pilot who's endorsed as level 4 on his license, flying and talking to controllers who may be actually above that standard. So this creates a problem. It creates problems with what is actually compliance in terms of the ICAO requirements. Do we know what compliance means anymore? We've got doubts around language proficiency testing standards. States, I think, are losing trust and confidence in neighboring tests and even local tests that are being developed. And of course, the big issue here is there are safety implications. So these are clear threats to the ultimate success of the LPRs. Variations in testing standards not only mean that the tests themselves are measuring different levels, but what actually are they assessing? What skills are they assessing? So if we've got as I said before, a pilot flying through many different states, all with different perceptions of ICAO level 4 and what those tests assess, there are safety implications here. And the tendency is that over the years, that bar is being lowered. And of course, that's an undesirable outcome of the LPRs. We don't have uniform testing standards, and ICAO is striving for what they call LPR harmonization. That's not yet being achieved. And we're actually having difficulty in maintaining or improving testing standards. Improving, you'd think that would be straightforward, but that is actually something out of reach in many states. And as I said before, there's problems with safety assurances. Let's have a look at a scenario here. So imagine we've got a non-native English-speaking pilot who's got this level 4, a questionable level 4, issued in his license, and he's got to talk to a non-native English-speaking controller, also with this questionable level 4. Well, we've got ineffective testing standards globally. That can lead to problems with language training, ineffective language training. So those individual pilots and controllers, they may have low language proficiency and therefore insufficient communicative skills to actually negotiate meaning and become aware of what's actually transpiring, particularly with time pressure and low communicative efficiency. There are clear safety impacts here. I'll give you an example here. If imagine a pilot had a technical issue on board, maybe an engine fault. Now, normally he might say, I need to divert, I need to land. Now, if there's any issues with communication and that's not resolved quickly and the airspace is busy, that can't actually be addressed. And if it's possible, it could lead to a near miss or a fuel exhaustion situation that leads to an accident. So yes, it's not an immediate thing, but certainly it plays a role. And you can see this here in the, I don't know if you're familiar with the Swiss cheese model, something that was introduced in the early 1990s, particularly around aviation accidents. But I'm going to put the language proficiency into the Swiss cheese model. So we've got ineffective testing standards. Then we'd maybe have that issue on board that I mentioned. And then that's also compounded by a possible problem with technology. Remember, the aircraft have a lot of redundancy and backup systems. If two things fail, we've got an issue. Then we put in pilot and controller communication issues, high workload, a lot of traffic, not enough time to resolve those issues, again, because of communicative issues. If the Swiss cheese model plays out and those holes line up, indeed, we've got an issue with a possible incident or even an accident happening. So this is, I guess, the catalyst, all these things we've been talking about. This is a catalyst for the test design guidelines. And the main aim of the TDGs was to raise awareness of the issues at stake here, particularly with CAAs and test providers. Less effective testing has implications for safety and efficiency. It's also designed to facilitate that harmonization that ICAO is after in terms of test design. So in terms of the ELPR, the TDGs, their main function is to basically increase an awareness of these key concepts. And I won't go into it here, but validity in language testing, authenticity, a little bit around reliability. And that's, I guess, complex fields for CAAs, but just increase their awareness of the role of these when they're selecting and approving tests. And an outcome also of the TDGs is to offer guidance to test developers if they're willing to listen. Ultimately, the aim of the TDGs is to get that scope of the, let's not compare apples and oranges in the future. Hopefully we can be comparing more like for like, and maybe in the future, if things go well, even more streamlined, harmonized testing outcomes. Now, it's really important to point out that, and this has been happening around the world, that a lot of focus has been on test administration. Let's get the raters trained up. Let's get the raters reliable. Let's make sure they understand what level 4 is. And ICAO's position is, well, yes, that's good, but we cannot and should not do that until we've got a baseline that's well understood and more uniform. And that, of course, comes back to test design. Once that's established, yes, we can look at rating and test administration procedures. And that then equips the CAAs to be far more likely to have confidence in their auditing, selection, and approval of tests, and hopefully weed out the tests that are not compliant. And in other words, not assessing the right skills or up to the right standards. And I think this is my own personal goal, that if we can achieve these, there's more scope for that confidence to be improved, and perhaps more collaboration and sharing between the industry. What I mean by that is maybe CAAs in a region helping each other, doing joint rater training projects, even sharing test design principles. So ICAO's observation in the last 10 years, which led to the origin of the TDGs, is a lot of test developers have insufficient expertise in language testing. As I said before, the CAAs aren't necessarily aware of these concepts. They just tend to accept what's given. And that's not their fault. It's just a lack of expertise being in the system at the moment. That's led to these ineffective testing practices. And as I said earlier, some tests are being perceived as easier and tend to become more popular. And because of all this trend, the investment in maintaining or developing good tests is not there anymore. With the dominant tests, the cheaper tests, not necessarily, it's not a cheaper activity to develop a valid, effective, and authentic test. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of expertise, and with that, of course, investment in money. And this recent trend has led to test shopping, not just by individual pilots and controllers, but also by organizations where they may have a vested interest in having their pilots and their controllers, their staff staying compliant. And that tends to lower the standards. Test service providers, TSPs, opting to take the shortcut and lower those standards. They have to do that to stay in the market, to stay competitive. So some examples here of what we've observed in some of these testing practices. A lot of tests, I'm not saying this is across the board, but a lot of the tests that we're familiar with, not all of them, but they have predominantly rely on oral proficiency interviews. Interlocutor, test taker, answering questions. There are a lot of tests lack operational content. There's a lot of technical, specific language in the aeronautical communication context they're omitted or not even included in the tests. Some tests are used for both pilots and controllers, probably because of the lack of operational content. They often, in some parts of the world, particularly in Asia, I think, a lot of tests comprise just random questions. And there's no opportunity for the test takers and the interlocutors to build up some sort of dialogue, some sort of interactive communication. It's almost like you could get a computer to deliver these tests and record the answers. In some cases, the comprehension is completely based on the test taker's understanding of those OPI, those interview questions. Obviously, that's not a valid way of assessing comprehension. There's some inclusion of tasks where candidates are asked to just listen and repeat what is heard. This is an example of a flawed or less effective test task. Maybe summarize dialogues as an example of how well they've understood this. They're not necessarily common, but they're examples of things that happen. A very little attempt, surprisingly, very little attempt to assess communication in radio telephony context. And I think that stems from what I said earlier, that broad and narrow interpretation. It takes a lot of skill, it takes a lot of expertise, investment, and consulting with pilots and controllers, subject matter experts, to develop meaningful radio telephony test tasks. So if there's an outlet that says the broad interpretation is valid, and you're new to this field, that's where a lot of test developers have gone. I think there's an over-reliance on picture description, which is not necessarily a bad thing to have sometimes, but as the predominant focus of the test is not very authentic. Pilots and controllers don't normally describe pictures or describe what they can see. Another typical issue is highly fragmented, disconnected test content. And sometimes assessing responses in terms of technical knowledge or ability to respond to the interlocutor rather than the actual language. Sometimes, and we'll look at this a little bit later, sometimes tests lack a sufficient breadth of input and complexity in the questions or the items and the tasks to evaluate higher levels, even though the test developer, the test provider, makes these claims. And one thing I've noticed in this part of the world is because of that lack of complexity in the test tasks, is test takers who do okay, they don't make mistakes, are rewarded and they're given higher levels, but even though they may not be able to have that ability or that opportunity to demonstrate the use of complex, higher level language. And as a result of all these things, we can see tests constructs tend to be skewed more to general language rather than aeronautical aviation language in the target language domain that they should be assessed in. And there's little or no demonstrated awareness of what cut scores are, how to establish, for example, the boundary between a level 3 and a level 4. And we'll look at this in a minute, but the importance of parallel versions, particularly for test bank security and reliability. So we came up with 8 really important criteria that formed the basis for the test design guidelines. You can see them here. We're going to go through them one by one. And it's not a lot of things to talk about here, but I'll go through it really briefly. Some of them are clearly a lot more important. Number 1 here is a very important one based on what I talked about earlier. So the first one, test tasks or tests need to include contexts that allow or elicit radio telephony communication. And the aim here is, RT is radio telephony. The aim here is to include radio telephony in both speaking and listening components of tests. This, of course, improves the authenticity and the validity of the results. It takes account of that target language use domain. And limit the scope, not necessarily completely remove, but limit the scope for tests to only assess general English proficiency. It also encourages assessment of proficiency that matches the test taker's needs. And that cannot be underestimated. The pilots and the controllers will therefore respect the test, the results, and feel that the whole exercise, including training around these tests, is more useful and more acceptable for their work needs. And that informs the test construct as well. Let me explore this a little bit more, what I'm talking about with when I say test construct. So if we look at a general English test, it requires some skills that need to be assessed, particularly if we're looking at writing, reading, listening, speaking, and maybe some communication skills. So these things, if we were to bundle them up in terms of the test design and think about how we're going to assess them, they would inform the test construct. In other words, the test takes a sample of the ability of the test takers to effectively use or understand or have a knowledge of those skills in the test. And that sample may assess these skills. That basically is informing the test construct. But in an LPR test, as I said before, we don't want writing skills. But it's a very technical field where there's a lot of operational knowledge that may inform the background role of the communication, including technical knowledge, things like procedures, equipment, how things operate in the airspace, in the aircraft. And of course, radio telephony skills. That includes things like phraseology. And you'll see there the 6 criteria in the LPR rating scale. And of course, listening comprehension. So if we put all those together, we remember it's communicative. They have to have communicative skills, not just treat the individual in isolation. It's the communication between pilots and controllers. That might be the basis for an LPR test construct. But of course, we don't want to assess the knowledge components there. Again, that sample there could be the basis for a test construct, for an LPR test. The language skills and the knowledge that need to be assessed. If we did that effectively, we might say the test has high construct validity. It might assess these skills, not necessarily completely effectively, but it makes a good attempt to do this. But there's problems emerging, and this is what I was alluding to before. If the tests don't assess that, but make the claims that they're an LPR test construct, they're not assessing the right skills or knowledge for aeronautical communication. And therefore, the test probably would have low construct validity. It may even assess general skills at the expense of the correct construct for the pilots and the controllers. And would again have low construct validity. Well, that's a big one. But the second one here is a little bit simpler, and it's very simple: separate tests for pilots and controllers. The aim here is to, again, increase validity of the test results and take account of the language that pilots and controllers need. They are different. They definitely are different. And that improves the respect among the respective test taker populations of the results they receive. I won't go through this, but pilots and controllers do have different language needs. You can see that on the screen here. The main thing is asking and giving for information is a little bit different in terms of the pilot's role in this and the controller's role. Third criterion is separate listening from speaking. It doesn't mean necessarily you can't assess comprehension in an OPI or a role play situation, but not at the expense of making some attempt to assess listening separately. Also very important. And the reason we've included this is so that test providers don't just make that attempt to assess comprehension in an interlocutor test taker environment where they're saying, oh, did he understand the prompt, as opposed to input that specifically are designed for listening comprehension. And you see here, there's an example of what the construct, if you like, around aeronautical communication might be in a listening test. A lot going on, and it's a lot more than should be tackled just in a speaking context alone. The fourth one here is having distinct sections with a variety of task types. The aim here is, again, the more task types within limits, the better the validity or the outcome of the results. Not having just one task type is problematic and maybe not fair. It encourages assessment that matches more likely is to match the test taker's needs and improves the test construct and the results. The fifth one here is really about the communication. So encouraging that, if you like, shared interactive communication, not, as I said earlier, listen to a question, respond, and then receive a brand new topic that's completely disconnected. Communication is not like that, and this goes back to authenticity. So allowing this back and forth exchange between the test taker and the interlocutor. Again, removing that tendency for isolated, non-interactive communication. Examples here: role plays, co-constructed interactive and developed dialogues that are linked to common themes that the test taker can then develop, engage with an interlocutor. Number 6 here is having the tests allow to effectively differentiate between ICAO levels. And the way we've tackled this, the Icaea team, and in the test design guidelines, is to encourage incorporation of different tasks that are geared towards different levels. That's not the only way to do it, but it's probably the easiest way to do it for our audience here. So, and this means that the test, it's a bit hard to explain it here, but the result is not an artifact of the test taker's own response, but is derived from the actual test tasks. If I come up with an example here, I'll see if I can pull this off. Imagine we've got some pilots. Pedro, Pedro's a level 6, a real level 6. Tariq, a level 5. Andri, a level 4. And Boris, a level 3. When I see these levels, I mean in the abstract sense, irrespective of any testing, the ideal level, if you like. So we come along with an effective LPR test. And if it's an effective LPR test, it should have tasks that are suitable for each of those levels. So if Pedro comes back in and does that test, he should do well on all aspects of that test, including the level 6 items or the level 6 tasks. And similarly, Tariq would do well on all the tasks, maybe not so well on the level 6 tasks. And that would sort of confirm his level would be level 5. Similarly with Andrei and Boris, the test tasks, they would be able to perform up to that level, but not so well above the test tasks designed above their actual proficiency level. So if it's an ineffective test or not so well developed and designed, there may be this tendency for the test tasks to be skewed at lower level items or tasks. Now, if we put Pedro back in there, what's going to happen? Pedro is able to do very well on all of those tasks. So the raters will evaluate his performance, and it's likely he'll get, there's some confusion here. There's not a lot of evidence that he's able to perform up to the level 6 standards because he's doing really well. And it's possibly might just get level 4 if it was a good test. The test is administrated correctly. This is not likely to happen, though. We'll see that in a minute. Tariq may also get a level 4 because theoretically he's only demonstrating the ability up to those level 4 tasks. So he's going to be quite disappointed as well. Andrei, remember, he was a level 4. He's going to feel okay because he can cope with all the content in that test. Boris, he'll do okay up to the level 3 tasks. Now, if that test makes claims that they're able to assess to all the levels, we have a problem here. And this is particularly happening in some parts of the world. So if we put Pedro back into that ineffective testing system, and the raters come along, and this skewed perception of what level the higher levels are, there's not a lot of evidence that Pedro is a level 6, but he does so well on all the items, all the tasks in that test that he in fact does achieve a 6. What's going to happen with Tariq? You guessed it. He's also doing very well on all the aspects, all the tasks in that test. He also gets a level 6, much to his surprise. Andrei, well, he's doing exceptionally well on all those tasks that really can only assess up to level 4, but the test claims it's level 6. So he might get a level 5, let's say. He's going to be very happy. And Boris, remember, was supposed to be a level 3. Boris is doing exceptionally well on that test, and he may well get a level 4 and be quite happy with that, I'm sure. These are the sorts of things that have been happening, and it's an artifact of the tests not being well designed. Second last one here is tasks need to relate to real world contexts. And this is what I was talking about before, authenticity, the validity of the results. It certainly overlaps with the radio telephony content that I talked about with criterion 1, but also other aspects of the communication, maybe debriefing situations, talking to between controllers, between sectors, or between different countries in coordinating. And it encourages the proficiency and the test tasks to match the test taker's needs. So not necessarily all around radio telephony, but still have authenticity. The last one here is having multiple versions available. That, of course, improves. It's not really about test design, but we included it because it improves the security of the test. It also enhances the validity of the result. If a test is only with, let's say, 3 or 4 versions out there in a large population of test takers, they're very quickly going to become familiar with that content. And what we produced at the end of the TDGs is this, we call it the toolkit. So it allows CAAs to go through those 8 criteria and apply them in a sort of a systematic, sequential way. So you can see those first 3 crucial criteria, and the remainder are still important, but if the first 3 are not achieved, there's no point looking beyond that in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of a test. Bit of history of the TDGs before we finish off here is before COVID came along in 2019, 2020, we did run some workshops. We ran some workshops in Tbilisi and Luxembourg and Buenos Aires, and finally here in Bangkok. I think we had over 200 participants here. That was in 2019. As I said, COVID came along. There were plans to do this a little bit more broadly, but everything sort of stopped. But that doesn't mean the project has stopped, because fortunately, we're very fortunate that we've got good contacts, good relationship with ICAO, and there is a really good prospect. In fact, it's planned for this year, Q2 of this year, for the TDGs to be published as an official handbook. And we're quite optimistic that that will have a positive effect on allowing that harmonization, there are ICAO words, but standardization of testing standards. It may not have an immediate effect, but it's the groundwork that's there. And that will, of course, be particularly important as the role or the proportion of non-native English-speaking pilots and controllers increases with the traffic, and the traffic becomes a lot more complex. And I think this last point is really important, that effective testing practices and test design actually leads to more effective and meaningful language training. The LPRs weren't just about testing, but also about training. Now, that QR code there, for those of you who are interested, if you were to scan that QR code, it will take you to the ICAO website, and particularly about this project. And you'll be able to see references, all the criteria, the TDGs outlined in a lot more detail than I can cover here in this short time. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to pass back to Jennifer and see if we've got time for any questions that came up in the chat.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so we have a few questions here. Let me pull up the chat. Okay, so one question, kind of comment from Javier, but maybe a follow-on question. He mentions that in the case of pilots, they're constantly communicating with ground staff and cabin crew whose language standards may well be below par. Still, those other players are key elements of safety, but no LPR requirements exist for them. And as well, Michael, we're wondering about the assessment of pilots, particularly in RTF contexts, but how can we or should we also account for other communicative situations like pilots communicating with the crew, for example? I think you may have alluded to that a little bit with criteria 7, but if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that we don't just focus entirely on pilot controller communication, but we need to remember that was what the ICAO LPRs were not originally, they are aimed at that aspect for licensing. Now, it doesn't mean that other aspects of communication are not important, between multinational crew, between pilots and cabin crew where they may not share English as a first language. Yeah, definitely, even between pilots and engineers and maintenance crew, all really important. Lots of work to do here, but my view is, let's start with the pilot controller, get that aspect of the regulation worked out and some good testing standards as the basis for, let's then move on to other fields. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't ignore it. It's always omnipresent. Yeah, and Jennifer's right, criterion 7 does allude to that, and that does improve the validity of the test, but that's not really what the LPRs are focused on.
Yeah, and Javier, I would say standards for cabin crew, ground staff, that's a whole different area, maybe coming, who knows.
There's some talk about it. There's certainly talk about it, but I think the feeling is, let's get this right first. It's not mature enough to move on to another field.
Okay, and feel free, anyone, if you would like to unmute your microphone, you can ask a question verbally as well. Michael, one more question here. What would be, in your opinion, the impact of a single LPR test used across the world rather than having LPR test A, LPR test B, LPR test C, apples to oranges? What if there was just a single apple, for example?
Very good question, actually. Yeah, really, really good question. In fact, if anyone was at the initial symposia that ICAO conducted early 2000s about this whole issue, me included, I was there saying, why don't we just have one test? It's a lot easier to standard, have a standard, everyone will respect it. I still think it's a good idea. The problem in this, of course, is perhaps the horse is bolted. It's not impossible, but I think I'd be a supporter of it. Given looking at the last 20 years, the experiences that we've had where things have become quite divergent, no one could predict this. It is what it is, but there's still room to move, and that would have to come from ICAO, that decision. Now, unfortunately, ICAO is a complex organization. They have to respond to all the states and what the states want to do, and maybe it's a little bit too late. But let's see, it's not impossible, but definitely I'd be a supporter of that because of the discrepancies that we're seeing in testing. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Anyone would like to unmute your microphone and ask a question? Well, I have a question of my own, Michael. I'll ask you. I'm wondering about I can't remember which criteria, the extended and interactive communication, the need for that back and forth. And I'd like to hear your perspective on the ability of, I guess, English language people like us, applied linguists, to be able to do something like that, and what that would take for us to be able to perhaps play that role of an operational person, or do we need to bring in an operational person, a pilot or a controller, to be able to accomplish that?
Sure. That criterion doesn't necessarily just mean operational radio telephony communication. I mean, that's certainly one of them, and we would, in the TDGs, we advocate role plays. So to answer your question, ideally it's someone who's got an operational background, but not necessarily. If the test tasks are scripted and the interlocutors, the examiners, if you like, are trained to be confident with that content and understand the operational context that's happening in, they can pull it off effectively. And depends on who you talk to. Some people would say more effectively than the pilot or the controller, who may be focused on the operational context instead of the language. That's certainly an issue that can happen. But yeah, it doesn't have to necessarily be a pilot or controller participating in those role plays. Now, in terms of the other activities, let's imagine it was a debriefing. So a pilot talking to a senior chief pilot about an incident. They can be role plays that I think most linguistic people who are not necessarily pilots or controllers would feel a lot more comfortable with. But that criterion also relates to OPIs. So you could, as long as an OPI, I mean, I've seen tests develop that, tell me why you became a pilot. Response. Next question. Have you ever had an emergency? Okay, that they're not connected at all. So they're isolated responses. Or in another context, listen to a short recording. Tell me what happened. Completely different situation, another country, another recording. Tell me what happened. They're so isolated that the test taker doesn't have a chance to, one, negotiate meaning, and two, to actually engage in the topics. So I don't know if that's answering a question, but there is definitely a possibility that depending on the test administration system that's set up, the procedures, and the training that, lay people, if you like, can deliver these tests. Yes. Yeah, they definitely need support from SMEs, but ultimately it's still possible, I think.
Yeah, understood. All right, one more question, Michael, and then we'll wrap it up. A question here from another Jennifer in the participant list, Jennifer Bottrell. She says, ICAO is not requiring English standard testing in regards to written English. Is there work being done to generate SARPs for this? I have been involved in manuals, regulations, and legislation for aviation, and she's come across large slices of both government and industry who simply do not read these English language documents due to their lack of ability. And she believes this is a fundamental stumbling block for safety training and regulation. So any thoughts on testing or the ability for written English?
Yeah, I would agree, particularly if you look at manuals, so Boeing and Airbus manuals that they're originally written in English. A few years ago, they used to be translated. That stopped. I think the common theme is that they're kept in English. And those pilots and sometimes even controllers who use navigation systems that are written in manuals that are written by a foreign provider, they may not fully understand the content, and they definitely have safety implications. In terms of testing, this is similar to the first question. It's not yet on the cards. I know of some states, Malaysia here, south of Thailand, they've talked about doing this with pilots, that they have to be assessed in their reading skills, possibly to do with that issue. I'm not sure. But I think, as I said earlier, the industry needs to get this part right before we can move on. And I think there's a general consensus that things are not right. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael, for your time today on behalf of TESOL and, of course, for being our president for IKEA.
Thank you.
Again, we are going to have one more webinar coming soon. So however you learned about this one, I'm sure you can learn about the fifth one as well through TESOL portals or LinkedIn, Facebook. So we'll definitely share the word. And thank you everyone for coming. And we will hopefully see you next time. Thank you.